there are losses that do not heal. There are absences that remain open no matter how many years pass over them, no matter how much the world changes around the person who carries them. The loss that shaped everything in the life of the man the world would come to call Hikaru Genji was not a battle lost or a throne refused. It was the death of his mother. She was called Kiritsubo, a lady of the court whose beauty was spoken of in terms that other beautiful women found difficult to hear without feeling diminished. She had come to the emperor's attention not through ambition or strategy, but simply through the quality of her presence, the way she moved through a room, the way she listened, and the way she spoke, as if the words she chose mattered and had been chosen carefully. The way she seemed to carry within her some quality of light that drew other people toward her without their quite understanding why. The emperor loved her. This was not unusual in itself, because the emperor had many ladies at court and was expected to distribute his attentions among them according to the requirements of rank and political alliance. What was unusual was the degree to which he loved her, and the degree to which that love was visible, undisguised, a thing that everyone at court could see, and that many of them found deeply inconvenient. The court of those days was a world of exquisite surfaces and complicated interiors, a world in which what was said and what was meant occupied entirely different territories, a world in which rank and protocol governed every movement and every word, and in which the feelings of powerful people sent ripples through the entire social fabric in ways that those people themselves did not always see or understand. Kiritsubo was not of the highest rank. This was the problem, or at least this was the form the problem took at court. The emperor's love for her was inversely proportional to her social standing, which is to say that he loved her more than he loved women of greater rank. This inversion of the expected order created resentment among the ladies, who felt that their superior position entitled them to superior attention. Chief among these was Kokiden a lady of the highest rank and considerable political influence, whose son was the crown prince. She watched the emperor's devotion to Kiritsubo with a cold and focused displeasure that expressed itself not in open confrontation, but in the thousand small cruelties that court life made available to those who knew how to use them. The path from Kiritsubo apartments to the emperor's quarters was long. She had to pass through corridors where other ladies had rooms, and those corridors became, through Kokiden quiet influence, a kind of gauntlet, a passage lined with subtle humiliations, with closed doors and turned backs, and the particular kind of deliberate blindness that is more cutting than any insult directly spoken. Kiritsubo bore these things with a patience that was itself a kind of strength. The alternative was a confrontation she could not win, and she understood the court well enough to know that open resistance would only make things worse. So she walked those corridors day after day, and she smiled where smiling was required, and she maintained the composure of a woman who has decided that dignity is the one thing that cannot be taken from her unless she surrenders it herself. She had a child. The child was a boy, and he was beautiful in a way that seemed to exceed the ordinary category of beautiful children. His beauty was the kind that made people stop and look twice and then look again, uncertain whether what they were seeing was simply a very handsome child or something that operated by different rules entirely. The emperor recognized it immediately as something rare. The recognition deepened his love for the mother in ways that made Kiritsubo position at court simultaneously more precious and more dangerous. More precious because the emperor's attention and protection were real and genuine. More dangerous because that attention drew more resentment from those who had reasons to resent her. The child learned everything faster than children were supposed to learn things. Those who taught him came away from their lessons with the expression of people who have encountered something unexpected and are still working out what it means. He learned music and absorbed it as if it were a language he had always known. He learned poetry and produced, at an age when other children were still struggling with the basics, work that the adults around him found they could not dismiss. He was, from the beginning, Hikaru Genji in the making, though no one had given him that name yet. But Kiritsubo was not well. The cruelties of the court, the long walks through hostile corridors, the accumulated weight of years lived under the pressure of other people's resentment, all of these things had taken something from her that she could not recover. She grew thin. She grew pale in a way that was different from the fashionable pallor of court ladies, a pallor that had something of winter in it, something that suggested the withdrawal of warmth rather than its cultivation. The emperor watched this with the particular fear that love produces, the fear that the thing you love most is becoming less substantial, is thinning at the edges, is beginning to exist at a remove from the solid world. He summoned healers. He ordered prayers and rituals and consultations with every authority who might have something useful to say about the preservation of a life that had become, for him, the center around which everything else arranged itself. Nothing helped. The healers did what healers do, which is to apply the knowledge they have to situations that sometimes exceed that knowledge. The priests performed the ceremonies with the precision and devotion that their training required, and Kiritsubo continued to thin, continued to withdraw, continued to move by small and barely perceptible degrees in a direction that everyone could see and no one could stop. She died in the autumn. The season is significant in the classical tradition, because autumn carries with it the whole weight of association that Japanese poets had been accumulating for centuries. The falling of leaves, the shortening of days, the particular quality of autumn light that is beautiful precisely because it is on its way to something else, that holds within its clarity the knowledge of its own passing. Kiritsubo death in autumn was felt by those who wrote about it afterward as a terrible rightness, the rightness of something that is exactly as sad as it should be, that fits its grief the way a hand fits a glove. The emperor's grief was not the contained and dignified grief that court protocol prescribed for such occasions. It was the grief of a man who had loved without reservation, and who now faced the consequence of that lack of reservation. He could not eat. He could not sleep. He wandered through the apartments that had been hers, touching things she had touched, sitting in the places she had sat. He did the things that grief does when it refuses to accept that the person it was attached to is no longer present in the physical world. The court watched this with a mixture of sympathy and unease, because a grieving emperor is a distracted emperor, and a distracted emperor is a problem for everyone whose position depends on his attention. The child was 3 years old. He was too young to understand death in the way adults understand it, too young to have a framework for the absence that had opened in his life, but not too young to feel the absence, not too young to sense that something fundamental had changed, that the warmth that had been the center of his small world was no longer there. He was brought to the emperor, who looked at the boy's face and saw in it the face of the woman he had lost. The grief that had been almost unendurable became briefly and painfully more than unendurable. Then it became something else, something that incorporated the grief rather than being destroyed by it, a love for the child that was inseparable from and deepened by the love for the mother. The child would be raised at court, close to the emperor, educated and prepared for a life of distinction. The emperor would watch over him with the attentiveness of a man who has lost something irreplaceable and is determined not to lose what remains. This was the beginning of the story of the most admired man in the most refined court in the world, a man who would be loved by many and who would search, in every love, for the one he had lost before he was old enough to understand what loss meant. The boy grew. He grew into someone the court could not stop watching, not because he performed for their attention. His presence seemed to generate attention the way certain natural things generate light, effortlessly, as a function of what they are rather than what they are trying to do. He was called Hikaru Genji, the Shining One. The name tried to capture in 2 syllables what people experienced in his presence, that quality of luminosity, that sense of something exceeding the ordinary measure of human beauty and accomplishment. He learned what needed to be learned and learned it with a thoroughness that went beyond competence into something closer to transformation. Music, in his hands, became something different from what other musicians produced. Poetry, from his brush, arrived at meanings that other poets circled without quite reaching, and behind all of this, known only to those who looked carefully and thought about what they saw, was the absence that had been there since the autumn when he was 3 years old. The absence that would never be filled, no matter how many people moved through his life and no matter how many of them loved him. The absence that had a shape, a specific shape, the shape of a woman he could no longer remember, but whose loss had become the foundation of everything he was. The court moved on, as courts always do. Kokiden Onyogo's position was stronger now that Kiritsubo no Koi was gone, and she managed that position with the efficiency of a woman who has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of consolidation. The crown prince, her son, occupied the center of imperial succession, and the political arrangements of the court reorganized themselves around this new stability. The emperor was expected to move forward. He was expected, in the way that powerful men are always expected, to redirect his attentions toward the living. And eventually, after a period of mourning that everyone agreed was longer than strictly necessary, he began to look around him at the world. What he found there was something no one had expected, something that would reshape everything. Among the new ladies who came to court, he found a young woman who resembled Kiritsubo no Koi, not in any specific feature that could be pointed to and described, not in the color of her hair or the shape of her eyes or any particular detail that could be itemized and compared, but in some quality of presence, in the way she occupied the space around her, in something that the grieving emperor experienced as a kind of echo, the resonance between the woman who was gone and the woman who had arrived, a resonance that was painful and consoling at the same time. Her name was Fujitsubo. She was the daughter of a former emperor, a woman of the highest cultivation and the most refined accomplishments. and she was about to become the second great love of a man who had never stopped mourning his first. And she was about to enter the life of a small shining boy in ways that none of them, not the emperor, not Fujitsubo herself, not the boy, could possibly have foreseen. Part 2. Fujitsubo arrived at court in the way that certain people arrive, without fanfare and without announcement, and yet she changed the atmosphere of every room she entered in ways that people noticed, before they could have explained what they were noticing. She was the daughter of a former emperor. Her rank was high, her education thorough. Her accomplishments in music and poetry were not the merely competent accomplishments of a woman who had been well trained. They were the genuine accomplishments of someone drawn to these things by natural inclination, who had pursued them with real devotion. But none of these things were the primary reason the emperor had brought her to court. The primary reason was something that could not be stated directly, something that everyone in the court understood without needing to say it. Fujitsubo resembled Kiritsubo no Koi, not in any specific feature, not in the color of her hair or the shape of her face or any particular detail that could be itemized and compared, but in some quality of presence, in the way she occupied the space around her, in something that the grieving emperor experienced as a resonance, an echo between the woman who was gone and the woman who had arrived. It was painful and consoling at the same time, and the emperor, who was a man of real sensitivity, despite the enormous powers his position gave him, understood the complicated nature of what he was feeling without it causing him to feel it any less. The court had feelings about this, as courts always have feelings about the choices of the powerful. Kokiden no Yogo, who had spent years ensuring that Kiritsubo no Koi's position was as uncomfortable as possible, now found herself watching the emperor transfer his attention to a woman she could not as easily attack. Fujitsubo's rank was higher, her connections were stronger, her position at court was more defensible than Kiritsubo no Koi's had ever been, and Kokiden no Yogo, who was a calculating woman, understood that the tactics she had used before would not serve her here. She was patient. She was the kind of woman who could wait for the right moment without losing her sense of what the right moment would look like when it arrived. And so she watched, and she calculated, and she waited. The other ladies of the court formed their own opinions about the new arrival, opinions shaped by their various positions and their various investments in the existing arrangements of favor and attention. Some were curious, some were envious, some were simply interested, in the way that people who live in a world of limited entertainment are always interested in anything new that enters it. Fujitsubo navigated all of this with a grace that suggested she had not been surprised by any of it, that she had arrived at court understanding exactly what she was arriving into, and had prepared herself accordingly. Hikaru Genji was a child when Fujitsubo came to court. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, still at the age when children move through the world of adults with a freedom that comes from being not yet subject to all the constraints that adulthood imposes, still permitted into spaces and presences that would later be closed to him. He was brought into Fujitsubo's presence one day, as the child of the emperor was brought into the presences of the ladies of the court, as a kind of social occasion, an opportunity for the various parties to observe each other and form the impressions that would shape the relationships between them. What happened when Hikaru Genji looked at Fujitsubo for the first time is described in the old accounts with a care that suggests those accounts understood they were describing something important, something that would ramify through everything that followed. He looked at her, and something in him recognized something. Not her face, which he had never seen before, not her voice, which he had never heard, but something behind these things, something that his child's perception reached toward, without having the language to name what it was reaching for. He felt in her presence something he had not felt since the autumn when he was 3 years old, and the warmth at the center of his world had been extinguished. He felt warm. The emperor noticed his son's response to Fujitsubo and was moved by it in ways he could not have easily articulated. He understood, without needing to put it into words, that what the boy was responding to was the same thing he himself had responded to. The echo, the resonance, the quality that Fujitsubo carried within her that was not identical to Kiritsubo, but was continuous with her in some way that defied precise description. He encouraged the connection. He arranged for Hikaru Genji to spend time in Fujitsubo's company, to learn from her, to experience her presence as a regular feature of his life rather than an occasional encounter. This was, in one sense, a generous thing to do. A father recognizing what his son needed and trying to provide something close to it. In another sense, it was an arrangement whose consequences the emperor had not fully thought through, because the boy was growing, and what had been the uncomplicated warmth of a small child's response to someone who felt like home was becoming, as the years passed and the boy became a young man of extraordinary beauty and sensitivity, something considerably more complicated. The warmth was still there, but it was accompanied now by other things, by an awareness of Fujitsubo as a person rather than simply a presence, by a noticing of her particular qualities, her particular ways of speaking and thinking and moving through the world, by something that Hikaru Genji himself, at this stage, could not have named or categorized, could only feel as an intensity that gathered whenever she was near and dissipated slowly whenever she was gone. Fujitsubo was not unaware of this. She was an intelligent woman, and intelligence in the women of that court had a particular character, shaped by a world in which they had few avenues for the direct exercise of their considerable capabilities. They were not less intelligent than the men around them. They were, in many cases, more perceptive, more attuned to the subtle movements of feeling and relationship that constitute the real landscape of social life, and Fujitsubo was among the most perceptive of them. She saw what was developing in Hikaru Genji before he could have named it himself. She saw it taking shape through the years of his adolescence, in the way he looked at her and the way he didn't look at her, in the things he said and the things he was careful not to say, in the particular quality of attention he brought to their conversations. She understood that it was dangerous, not in the ordinary way that the attentions of a young man are sometimes inconvenient, but in a specific and irreversible way, because of who he was and who she was, and what the relationship between them was supposed to be. He was the emperor's son. She was the emperor's consort. She had been brought into the imperial household in part because of her resemblance to the boy's mother. The web of feeling involved was not simple, and there was no version of this situation that resolved itself comfortably. Fujitsubo knew this with the clarity of a woman who had spent her life in a world that required her to know uncomfortable things clearly. She maintained the distance that the situation required. She did this with the discipline of someone who understands that discipline, in some circumstances, is not a constraint on life, but a form of it, a way of preserving the conditions under which anything decent can continue to exist. She was careful in the arrangements of their encounters. She was careful in the content and the tone of their conversations. She was careful in all the ways that a careful person can be careful, and her carefulness was not, it should be said, born of indifference. A woman indifferent to Hikaru Genji would not have needed to be so careful. The need for the discipline was itself evidence of something, evidence that the feelings she was managing were not simple, were not merely the feelings of an older woman responding with appropriate warmth to a talented child who had grown into an admirable young man. They were something else, something she did not give a name to, because naming things gives them a reality they can be harder to refuse, and Fujitsubo was not a woman who created difficulties for herself by being more honest than the situation required. She felt what she felt. She managed what she felt, and between the feeling and the management, in the space that these two things created and maintained, something lived that neither of them had chosen, and that neither of them could entirely dismiss. Part 3. There are things that happen that cannot be taken back. There are moments when a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed, when the world divides into before and after. Everything that comes after carries the weight of the crossing, even when no one speaks of it, even when both people involved have agreed, in the way that people agree to these things, to proceed as if nothing has changed. Something had changed. Hikaru Genji was a young man now, grown past the age at which anyone who looked carefully could mistake what he felt for Fujitsubo for anything simpler than what it was. He was extraordinary in his beauty and his accomplishments, admired and pursued from every quarter of the court. But none of the admiration he received from others, none of the pursuit or the flattery or the offers of connection that came his way, displaced what he carried for Fujitsubo. The feeling had grown alongside him. It had not diminished with time or exposure, or the reasonable expectation that a young man of his qualities would eventually redirect his attention towards someone available and appropriate. It had deepened instead, had become more specific, more precise, more inseparable from his understanding of who he was and what he wanted from the world. Fujitsubo had maintained the distance she knew was necessary. She had maintained it with discipline and with intelligence and with a steadiness that had cost her something she could not quite name, a kind of continuous expenditure of the self in service of the correct management of an incorrect situation. She had not always found it easy. She had found Hikaru Genji difficult to be indifferent to, had found him difficult to hold at the remove that her understanding of the situation required. Not because he pressed against the distance. He was, in his way, respectful of it, or at least careful enough not to make his disrespect obvious, but because the quality of his attention, even at a careful distance, was not the kind of attention that was easy to receive without feeling something in return. There were circumstances she had not anticipated. Moments when the ordinary structures of court life became porous, when the protocols and the attendance and the careful management of access and proximity allowed what had been kept separate to come together. One such moment came. How it came, whether through accident or design or some combination of the two that resists easy categorization, the old accounts are careful not to specify. as if the authors understood that some things are better approached at an angle than directly. What the accounts say is that Hikaru Genji found his way to Fujitsubo, and that Fujitsubo in that moment did not send him away. What followed was brief. Brief in the way that certain experiences are brief, not because they lack weight or significance, but because the conditions that make them possible are themselves unstable, cannot be maintained, cannot be extended without collapsing under the pressure of what they contain. Afterward, Hikaru Genji carried what had happened within him like a stone, like something that had weight and permanence. It altered the way he moved through the world, subtly but definitely, in ways that a careful observer would have noticed. He did not try to repeat it. He understood, with the intelligence that coexisted in him alongside the feeling that had produced the situation, that to try to repeat it would be to risk everything. Whatever existed between them was already in a form so fragile and threatened that the addition of any more weight might cause it to collapse entirely. He held it instead, held it the way people hold the things that have become too important to be risked in any further action. Fujitsubo held it differently. She held it with the steadiness of a woman who has understood from the beginning of her adult life that the wrong information in the wrong hands means ruin. She had developed, through years of careful navigation, the capacity for exactly this kind of steadiness. The consequences arrived as they always arrive, quietly at first, in the form of a physical change that Fujitsubo recognized before she was fully prepared to acknowledge what it meant. She was with child. The child's father was not the emperor. This was a secret of extraordinary danger, a secret that, if known, would have destroyed not only Fujitsubo's position at court, but the entire fabric of the imperial succession. The child, if male, would be in line for the throne. A throne occupied by a child whose true parentage was hidden was a throne built on a lie of the most consequential kind. Fujitsubo held the secret. She held it alone, in the way that the most dangerous secrets must be held. She told no one, confided in no one, sought no counsel from anyone who might have helped her manage what she was managing. Because the management of this particular secret did not permit the involvement of counsel. Every person who knew was another point of vulnerability, another place where the secret might leak, another risk she could not afford. So she held it alone, and she carried it alone, and she managed her own face and her own behavior and her own interactions with the emperor with a composure that must have required everything she had. Hikaru Genji knew. He knew, and the knowing was both the fulfillment of something he had wanted for years and the beginning of a fear that would accompany him for the rest of his life. He had wanted this. He had wanted it with a desperation that had made him careless of consequences in a way that was, for a man of his intelligence and perception, unusual. But wanting something and receiving it are different things. The receiving had not resolved the longing that had driven him toward it. It had transformed the longing into something more complex, something that incorporated guilt and fear and tenderness, and the terrible, unmanageable awareness that the person he had drawn into danger was someone he could not protect. He could not acknowledge the child. He could not stand beside Fujitsubo in any visible way. He could not do anything, in fact, except watch from a distance and hope that the secret held, and carry within himself the knowledge of what he had done and what it had cost. He was very good at carrying things within himself. He had been practicing since he was 3 years old. The child was born. He was a boy. He was beautiful. The emperor received him with a joy that was, for the two people in the room who knew the truth, painful to witness. He looked at the child and saw in the boy's features a resemblance to Hikaru Genji, which he attributed to the shared bloodline, which was not entirely wrong, though not in the way he understood. He named the child and celebrated the birth and looked forward to the future with the hope that older men bring to the contemplation of the very young. Fujitsubo watched all of this with a composure that must have required everything she had remaining. Hikaru Genji watched from a greater distance. The child who was not the emperor's son would eventually become the emperor. He would be called Renunciation. He would rule with a conscientiousness that those who served him found admirable. He would carry in his face the features that came not from the man he believed to be his father, but from the man who was. And he would carry within him, for many years, the truth of his parentage as an unidentified weight, a pressure without a name, a sense of something important remaining unsaid in the world around him. When he finally learned the truth, it would change something in his understanding of himself that was never entirely repaired, but that was later. For now, the secret held, and Fujitsubo had survived the first and most dangerous phase of what she would spend the rest of her life managing. Part 4. Hikaru Genji had a wife. He had been married young, in the way that men of his station were married young, to Aoinue, the daughter of a powerful minister, a match made for political reasons and conducted with the formality that such matches required. Aoinue was beautiful and accomplished, and entirely aware that her husband's heart was not with her. She was not a woman who concealed her feelings easily. There was a constraint between them that was visible to anyone who cared to look, a recognition that they were bound together by forces neither had chosen, and that the binding was not accompanied by the warmth that might have made it bearable. Hikaru Genji treated her with the courtesy that was expected of him. He gave her the attention that protocol required. She received these things with the coolness of a woman who knows the difference between what is offered and what is withheld, and who has decided not to pretend otherwise. It was not a comfortable marriage. It was not, by the standards of that world, an unusual one either. Marriages in the Heian court were not primarily arrangements of the heart. They were arrangements of alliance and succession, and the management of political relationships between powerful families. That hearts were sometimes involved was a complication, not a requirement. The world of the court was also the world of the festival, the procession, the public ceremony in which the hierarchies of rank and privilege were displayed for everyone to see. At the great Kamono Matsuri, the festival that drew all of court society to watch the procession pass, something happened that would set a chain of events in motion. Rokujo Nomiya Sudokoro, a woman Hikaru Genji had been visiting, attended the festival in her carriage. She was the widow of a crown prince, a woman of the highest cultivation and the most refined sensibility. She had loved Hikaru Genji in the way that distinguished women sometimes love men who are younger and more brilliant, with a devotion that was not quite appropriate and that she managed with great care. At the festival, Aoinue's attendants, making way for their mistress's carriage, pushed Rokujo Nomiya Sudokoro's carriage to the side of the road. It was done deliberately, as these things were always done deliberately. Everyone present understood what it meant. Rokujo Nomiyasudokuro was forced to watch the procession from a position that declared, as clearly as any spoken words could have, that she was of lesser consequence. She held this inside. She held it with the dignity of a woman who has learned that the direct expression of feeling in the world she inhabits is a luxury she cannot afford. But feeling held inside does not disappear. It finds other channels. What left Rokujo Nomiyasudokuro's body at night terrified her when she became aware of it. It was not something she had sent deliberately. It was something she could not stop. Her spirit, carrying the weight of the humiliation and the accumulated resentment of years, was traveling through the darkness toward the woman who had pushed her carriage aside. Aoinue fell ill. The illness was not the ordinary illness of a body failing for physical reasons. The healers and priests who attended her recognized it as something external, a possession, a will operating through her body in ways that her own will could not resist. She was with child, Hikaru Genji's child, and the illness that gripped her was particularly cruel because it endangered not only herself, but the life she was carrying. Hikaru Genji sat with her through those terrible nights. Something shifted in him during that time. The distance that had always existed between them, the distance he had maintained without quite choosing it, the distance that came from his heart being elsewhere, became in those nights impossible to maintain. He was with her in a way he had not previously managed to be. He held her hand. He was present. And she, in the openness that illness sometimes produces, received his presence with a vulnerability that suggested she had not entirely given up on the possibility of something real between them. The child was born, and then Aoinue died. The death came after the birth, in the manner of deaths that follow difficult deliveries, despite everything the healers and priests could do. It left Hikaru Genji with a grief that surprised him by its depth. He had not loved her well. He knew that. He had been somewhere else for most of their marriage, his attention and his heart directed toward things she could not have competed with, and had perhaps stopped trying to compete with. And now she was gone, and with her departure went the possibility of doing better, the possibility that the connection he had felt in those last nights might have been the beginning of something rather than the end. He buried the grief beneath the surface of his extraordinary social competence, and continued to be Hikaru Genji in the world. But the grief was there, and things were accumulating. Secrets and losses and the weight of choices made and unmade, gathering beneath the surface that was becoming harder to maintain. The crisis came not slowly but suddenly. Hikaru Genji had become involved with Oboro Zukio, a woman connected to Kokiden Onyogo. Kokiden Onyogo had been waiting for years for exactly this kind of opportunity. She was a patient woman, a woman who understood that the powerful do not always need to act against their enemies directly. Sometimes it is enough to wait until an enemy creates the conditions of their own destruction, and then to make sure those conditions are known to the people whose knowing of them will produce the desired result. She moved against Hikaru Genji with the efficiency of someone who has been preparing for exactly this moment for a very long time. The consequence was exile, not the formal declared exile of a criminal, but the understood exile of a man who recognizes that remaining in the capital is no longer a viable option, and who removes himself before the less comfortable alternative is imposed. Hikaru Genji went to Suma, a coastal province far from the capital, and the brilliant world of the court was replaced by the spare and sometimes beautiful world of the sea. He had lost his wife, he had lost his position, he had the secret of Renunciation's parentage still coiled inside him. Suma was not without its consolations. There was the sea, which is indifferent to rank and to the complications of court life, which continues its movements regardless of what the people on its shores are suffering or hoping or remembering. There were evenings when the light on the water was a thing of such clean beauty that it seemed to belong to a different order of experience from the layered and complicated beauty of the capital. And there was time that Hikaru Genji, who had never had much of it before, now had in abundance. Time to sit with the things he had been carrying, and to examine them with a thoroughness that his previous life had not permitted. He thought about his mother. He thought about Fujitsubo. He thought about Awinue, and about the opportunities he had allowed to pass unused. He wrote poetry that the people who received it found almost unbearably moving, poetry that arrived at the particular combination of beauty and grief that can only be produced by someone who has earned both. He was, in summa, reduced to something more essential than the brilliant surface he had presented to the world. And what was underneath the surface, it turned out, was a person of genuine depth, someone worth knowing in a way that the shining exterior had sometimes obscured. Part 5. Hikaru Genji returned from exile. He returned the way things return when their absence has created a need that could not be met by anything else. The return had a quality of inevitability, feeling less like an event and more like a correction, a restoration of something temporarily and inconveniently displaced. Renunciation was on the throne now. The child whose true parentage remained secret had become the emperor, and the accession of Renunciation changed the political landscape in ways that made Hikaru Genji's return not only possible but welcome. Kokidenon Yogo's influence had diminished with the accession of a new emperor. The alignments had shifted, and Hikaru Genji came back to a capital that received him with the enthusiasm reserved for things whose absence has made their value clear. He was powerful again. He was admired again. The residences he had left behind were restored to him, and he set about building something that had not existed before, a compound of extraordinary beauty that would come to be called the Roku Join. The Roku Join was designed to house the women who were important to him, arranged according to the seasons that suited each of them. It was simultaneously a great aesthetic achievement and a kind of monument to the complicated and layered architecture of his emotional life. Fujitsubo was not among the women of the Roku Join. She had not been idle during the years of Hikaru Genji's exile. She had been working, with the quiet efficiency of a person who understands what they are doing and why, toward the thing that she had been moving toward for years. She took religious vows. She cut her hair. She exchanged the layered silks of court life for the plain dark robes of a nun. In doing so, she crossed a threshold she had been approaching for a long time, perhaps since the moment she understood what was happening between herself and Hikaru Genji, and recognized that there was only one direction in which safety lay. The decision was not made in crisis. It was the culmination of years of interior movement, years of carrying a secret, and managing a silence and maintaining a composure that had never been simply about protocol, but about survival. She had survived, and now she was moving beyond survival into something else, into a life organized around different principles, quieter principles, principles that did not require the constant vigilance of a court lady managing an impossible situation. Hikaru Genji received the news of her vows after they were taken. He had not been consulted. He had not been warned. He had not been given the opportunity to argue against it, which was, of course, precisely why Fujitsubo had done it the way she had done it. She knew what his argument would have been. She knew it would have been persuasive. She knew her own capacity to be persuaded by him, which was one of the things she had been managing for years. The only way to protect the decision against that persuasion was to make it irrevocable before the persuasion could arrive. He went to her. The meeting between them after the vows were taken is described in the old accounts with the particular restraint that belongs to scenes whose weight exceeds what direct description can carry. He sat with her in her new simplicity. He looked at the plain dark robes. He understood, with the finality that some understandings carry, that a certain chapter had ended, not the feeling. Feelings do not end simply because circumstances require them to, but the possibility of anything further, anything additional, anything that might have complicated or continued what had already existed between them, was gone. Fujitsubo spoke to him with the gentleness and the clarity of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. She spoke about Renunciation, about the importance of protecting what had been built and what had been concealed, and of not adding to the danger by continuing to orbit each other in ways that invited scrutiny. She spoke without anger and without reproach, because anger and reproach would have implied that she held him responsible in a way that absolved herself, and she was not willing to construct that accounting. What had happened had been done by both of them. The consequences were being managed, as best they could be managed, through the decisions she was making now. Hikaru Genji listened. He understood. An understanding did not make it easier. He returned to the world and continued to be Hikaru Genji in it, which required a great deal, and which he managed with the extraordinary facility that had always been his primary protection against the weight of everything he was carrying. He visited her occasionally, as it was appropriate to visit a woman of her former station who had taken vows. These visits were conducted with the decorum that the new situation required. They discussed Renunciation. They discussed the management of the secret that both of them would carry for the rest of their lives. They were, in the language of the world they inhabited, on perfectly appropriate terms, and in the space between what was said and what was felt, the entire history of what had existed between them continued to exist, preserved and enclosed, no longer capable of producing anything new, but also not gone. There is a kind of relationship that ends in everything except its own existence. The visits continued, and the decorum was maintained, and the secret held, and Fujitsubo was not, in her religious life, unhappy. This matters. The temptation when telling a story of this kind is to read the renunciation as defeat, as the retreat of a woman who had been acted upon by circumstances too powerful to resist, and had retreated into religion as the only exit available. But Fujitsubo was not a passive figure. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and will, who had made choices throughout her life with full awareness of their consequences, and the choice she was making now was not the last resort of someone without options. It was the chosen direction of someone who understood, clearly and without illusion, what she was choosing and what she was leaving behind. She had had the court. She had had the emperor's love. She had had the secret and the danger and the years of managing both. She was choosing now something different. And in the quiet of her rooms, in the measured rhythm of the religious life, she was finding that the different thing she had chosen was not nothing. Part 6. Fujitsubo died in the spring. She was not old. By the accounting of her era, she was in the middle of a life that might reasonably have continued for many years. The illness that took her was not the kind that announces itself with the long forewarning of a slow decline. It arrived and progressed with a speed that left everyone around her insufficient time to fully understand what was happening before it was over. Hikaru Genji received the news in the way that people receive the news of deaths they have been dreading for a long time, without quite admitting to themselves that they were dreading it, not with surprise, with recognition, the recognition of something expected, something that had been waiting, something that is no less devastating for its arrival having been anticipated. He had known she was not well. He had heard reports from those who had access to her household, had read between the lines of the occasional formal communications that passed between them. He had sensed in the quality of those communications a thinning, a withdrawal, a distance different from the chosen distance she had maintained since her vows. He had not let himself understand what it meant. He could not mourn her openly. This was the particular cruelty of his situation, different from the cruelty of ordinary loss. Ordinary loss can be expressed and witnessed and shared. Ordinary grief can be acknowledged and mourned in the presence of others who recognize it and respond to it with the particular human generosity that grief calls forth. His could not, because the relationship that had existed between them was not one the world knew about. It was not one he could acknowledge, not one that could become the subject of the condolences and the ceremonies and the shared remembrance through which loss is processed and, in some partial measure, absorbed. He could mourn her as a member of the court mourns a respected figure of former distinction. He could wear the appropriate expressions. He could observe the appropriate rituals. He could say the appropriate things to the appropriate people. What he could not do was weep, not in public, not with the full weight of what she had been to him, not with the full weight of everything, not with the weight of the moment when he had been a small child and something in him had recognized something in her, not with the weight of all the years of feeling and restraint and one unretractable moment and its consequences, through the vows and the visits and the careful decorum that followed. All of it, the entire architecture of what they had been to each other, which was a thing that had no name in the vocabulary of the world they inhabited. He went to her rooms after the death rituals were completed. He sat in the spaces where she had lived her quiet religious life, where she had spent her last years in the peace she had chosen, away from the complications of court, away from the requirements of managing an impossible situation, with the composure of someone for whom it was not impossible. The rooms held the particular stillness that comes to spaces that have been inhabited by someone who has spent long hours in meditation, a quality of settled quiet, as if the air itself had been shaped by the practice of stillness, He sat for a long time. He thought about his mother. He thought about Fujitsubo. He thought about the thread that ran between them, the thread he had been following his entire life without always seeing where it led, the thread that had started in the autumn when he was 3 years old, and the warmth at the center of his world had been extinguished, the thread that had pulled him toward Fujitsubo, with the inevitability of something set in motion, before he was old enough to resist it. He had lost her twice. The first time was when she took her vows and the possibility closed. The second time was this. Renunciation continued to rule. The emperor who carried the secret in his face without knowing what it was continued to rule with the conscientiousness that his subjects found admirable. The secret continued to hold. Fujitsubo had carried her half of it to the grave without speaking it, which was the last and in some ways the greatest act of the discipline she had exercised throughout her life. The secret would not hold forever. Secrets of this magnitude rarely do. There are too many ways for truth to leak, through the accumulation of hints and resemblances and the observations of perceptive people, through the guilt of those who carry it, and the curiosity of those who sense that something remains unexplained. Renunciation would eventually learn what he was, and the learning would change something fundamental in him, something that would never be entirely repaired. But Fujitsubo would not be alive to see it. She had done what she could. She had held what needed to be held. She had managed what needed to be managed. And she had left the world as she had lived in it, with composure and with the particular integrity that belongs to people who understand the difference between what they can control and what they cannot, and who choose within that understanding to act as well as they are capable of acting. Hikaru Genji lived for many years after her death. He built beautiful things. He loved people, or tried to, in the way that a person tries to love when the primary love of their life has taken a form that could never be straightforwardly expressed or cleanly mourned. He found in Murasaki Nue something that came close to what he had felt for Fujitsubo, close enough that the closeness was not coincidence. He found in the many women of his life the particular combination of connection and inadequacy that characterizes the loves of people who are searching for something that cannot be found in any single person, because what they are searching for is not a person, but a feeling, a warmth, a presence, the ghost of something lost in an autumn long ago. At the end of his story, there is a chapter that exists only as a title. It is called Kagaya Kuhinomiya, the radiance of the Shining One, and it contains no text, only its title, as if the author understood that some endings cannot be written, that the final dimming of a light that has been present throughout must be allowed to happen in silence, without words, without the imposition of meaning on something that exists beyond meaning's reach. What we are left with is the story itself. Kiritsubo, who died in an autumn and left behind a grief that became a longing that became the foundation of everything. Fujitsubo, who carried the weight of a secret and the weight of a love that had no name, and who found at the end, in the quiet of her chosen life, something that the brilliant and complicated world of the court had not been able to provide, and between them, the life of a man who spent everything he had searching for what he had lost before he was old enough to understand what loss was. The world's first novel does not resolve this. It does not explain it or redeem it, or offer the consolation of a meaning that makes it bearable. It holds it, It holds it with the patience of a writer who understood that this is what great stories do. They hold the things that cannot be resolved. They hold them carefully. They hold them without letting go. And in the holding, something is preserved that would otherwise be lost. Something true about what it is to love and to lose, and to go on living in the space that the loss has made.